Good afternoon. One more, everyone. I'm Victoria Young. I'm chair of the art history department, and I'm here now as Hayley's advisor. And the way I've listened to all of my colleagues introduce our students today, everybody has this moment, right? You guys all had this moment when something really special happened and you decided you were going to write your paper on this topic, and then you saw things, and that is this kind of shining glory as art historians that we all look for. All my colleagues can attest to this. I think Hayley had it probably before she knew it. Growing up in a family that deals with the built environment so intently, it's just, it's kind of like I was thinking about Frank Lloyd Wright's mother, hanging the mobile over his crib and telling him he's going to be an architect. I don't know if your folks did that. We'll talk to them about that later. But, these are these really fantastic things that kind of ingrain yourselves. And it's always fun for me as an architectural historian to work on projects like this with someone like Hayley. So Hayley has really, though, done exactly what we hope students will do in this program with this incredible faculty that we have, an adjunct faculty who embrace so many different disciplines, so many different approaches to material, so many different subject matters, to really draw upon everything you learn here to pull a topic together. And you've all been really great at doing that. All the way from studying with Mark in the ancient times, all the way up to the Ford Center, right? You've done so many things. And, kind of one of these fun moments I had with Hayley on this project was, when she told me, well, it's post-Black and postmodernism and post-structuralism and post-Black. I'm like, post-Black, right? Well, that's Heather Shiry's African-American course, right? Coming to bear on a historic preservation topic. And that was really fun just to see some of those things come together. Hayley worked really hard on this paper, and she had to convince me and one of our readers too that this was a topic and an approach that made sense, and she did. And she fought really hard to make that happen. It was really fantastic to watch because in preservation, the field's 50 years old, more or less, kind of intently focused, maybe a little bit more. And times change, but sometimes we don't see times change, right? And so it was really fantastic to have Hayley come in and show us that, yes, this whole preservation movement is something very different than what it started out to be. So now you all get to hear exactly what that's about. So please join me in welcoming Hayley Stoen for Heritage Redefined, Post-Preservation and the Historic Ford Center.
Thank you to my advisor, Dr. Victoria Young, for inspiring me to pursue in-depth study of architectural history. Your knowledge and passion for the field is extraordinary. Thank you, Victoria and Dr. Shelley Nordtorp Madsen, for your edits and commentary on my paper, and the entire St. Thomas faculty for sharing your expertise with me over the past 3 years. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank my family and friends, particularly my husband, Matt, who's offered me endless support and encouragement in this endeavor. I'd also like to thank my 2 children for their enthusiasm and sweetness, reminding me daily of what's truly important. Last but not least, I'd like to thank my loving parents who taught me early in life that work is fun, that I could be anything that I wanted to be, and to find beauty in the ordinary, among many other words of wisdom that I carry with me. Historic preservation today looks very different than it did years ago. The movement was originally founded upon the principles of preserving historic structures as found, or restoring them to their originally constructed state. Preservation is now most often represented by highly sophisticated examples of rehabilitation, also referred to as adaptive reuse. Post-preservation is an art historical theory that I have defined, which addresses the multifaceted nature of historic preservation in the present day. It articulates preservation's inherent duality that is equally concerned with premier architectural design as it is respectful of history. Post-preservation will be used as a construct to evaluate modern trends within the preservation movement. I will refer to the Ford Center in Minneapolis throughout this presentation as an example of post-preservation. In defining this theory, I am using the prefix post in the same manner that terms like post-impressionism and post-conceptualism emerged in response to or in reaction against the initial movement that is being referenced. In my research, I make the claim that today's preservation encompasses a highly functioning synergy between old and new that is redefining the timeless classic aesthetic as progressive, dynamic, and sustainable, and can be characterized as part of a broader movement. I have defined 5 characteristics of post-preservation that differentiate the concept from the movement as founded. The first is that the structure in question is considered historically significant. Second is that the project was undertaken for market-based reasons. Third is that the building has undergone an extensive rehabilitation. Fourth is that there are contemporary additions or changes that are architect designed. Fifth is that the project is an example of environmental sustainability. The semantics of preservation have long been complex. Renowned author and historic preservationist James Marston Fitch comments on the field's limited terminology, writing that, quote, "The rapid expansion of the field of historic preservation is marked by the need for more precise definitions and terminology," end quote. Norman Tyler, an architect, historian, and author, defines preservation as, quote, "the act of preserving or the maintenance of a property without significant alteration to its current condition." Post-preservation, then, defined by transformative rehabilitations, is clearly outside of this basic definition. It is important to distinguish preservation, post-preservation, from the treatment of preservation as defined by the National Park Service through the Secretary of the Interior. There are 4 categories of treatments of historic properties that are widely referred to and used within the professional field of historic preservation. They are preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction. My theory posits that it is the growing number of rehabilitations that can be attributed to the changing face of preservation today. In order to establish how post-preservation differs from the movement as founded, it is imperative to look back in time. In doing so, it becomes apparent that the federal government has contributed significantly to post-preservation's development. Historically, preservation movements have risen up with the threat of or actual destruction of a beloved community landmark, causing citizens to act. Most scholars agree that the first major preservation act in America was the saving of Philadelphia's Independence Hall in 1816. Concerned citizens galvanized over the threat of the building's destruction and successfully lobbied to save it, which has since gone on to become a World Heritage Site. The first designated preservationist group is considered to be the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, formed in 1859 in an effort to save George Washington's home, Mount Vernon, from demolition. These 2 examples of preservation are typical of the early movement, with average people rallying around buildings or sites related to an important national figure or significant event. The government's role in preservation emerged in 1933, with President Franklin Delano Roosevelt authorizing the formation of the Historic American Buildings Survey, which documented and recorded historic structures in the United States to make a database for the country's built environment. This marked the beginning of the nation's architecture being treated as a cultural resource. Up until this point, the focus of the National Park Service had been on the protection of natural resources. The National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 created the National Register of Historic Places and state historic preservation offices, which function as protection agencies for historic properties. Through this act, vernacular and utilitarian structures, as well as districts as a whole, could have legitimized historic value. This marked a shift in what was perceived as worthy of protection that continues to be the prevailing mentality today. Also significant was the Tax Reform Act of 1976 that fostered private sector investment in historic properties. The act documented the change from the purely civic-minded nature of preservation to one that was financially incentivized. 1976 was also the year that saw the introduction of rehabilitation as a treatment, which provided an alternative to simple preservation and restoration, moving beyond the concept of the living museum. Post-preservation's emergence was prompted by these key actions by the federal government. William Murtaugh, the first keeper of the National Register, writes, quote, "Old buildings, suddenly offering attractive economic potential, have caught the attention of whole new groups of Americans who would never have entered the preservation arena for altruistic reasons alone," end quote. The patriotic and nostalgic motivations that fueled the early movement have been joined by today's motivations related to profit and aesthetics of everyday buildings, an important distinction that is at the heart of post-preservation. Historic significance is the first defining characteristic of my theory. It can be related to a structure's architectural design or its unique social, political, or cultural heritage. For a building to be considered significant, according to the standards of the National Register, certain criteria must be met that determines its worthiness. The National Register recognizes a property's historic integrity through 7 aspects of qualities: location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. As an incentive to invest in historic properties, owners of historically significant buildings may apply for a 20% tax credit at the federal level, and in Minnesota, a 20% tax credit at the state level, although this varies between states. In order to qualify, the building must be an income-producing property that is listed in the National Register either individually or as a contributing structure within a historic district. Work related to the rehabilitation must be consistent with the Secretary of the Interior standards, with every detail scrutinized by government representatives. It is important to note that there are many examples of sensitive, well-done rehabilitations that may not have qualified for tax credits or adhered precisely to the Secretary's guidelines. These projects were considered financial opportunities by a developer nonetheless, and the proposed work passed their local Heritage Preservation Commission requirements. In either scenario, historic significance is recognized and a structure is saved for future generations of use. The contextual theory of Marxism that is used within the field of art history as a research methodology is based upon the materialist evolution of societal development. Through a Marxist lens, preservation becomes equally involved with economics as it is with history or architecture, as referenced by my second characteristic of post-preservation that deals with market-based realities. Donovan Ripkema, a development consultant and author, writes extensively on historic preservation as a development strategy. He states, quote, "Economics has taken its rightful place as one of the pillars upon which the preservation ethic is based, not more important than the cultural, aesthetic, sociological, or historical basis, but the time has come to recognize its equal importance," end quote. Ripkema contends that rehabilitation has vast economic impact that consistently increases the value of a neighborhood, generates local jobs, and supports small businesses. It is the differentiated product in economics that commands a monetary premium, and historic properties and districts offer distinction that is not easily replicated. In this regard, historic preservation is another form of economic production, a product of capitalism that essentially commodifies history. If not for the profitability factor and incentives that exist with post-preservation, bringing historic structures back to life may not be considered worth the extra effort by their undertaking. The preservation movement as founded did not have the type of financial implications that exist today, further differentiating my theory from preservation's original form. Postmodernism is an important methodology that has contributed to my theory and relates to my third characteristic that deals with rehabilitation and implementing new with old. Post-preservation is defined by the same hybridity that is the foundation of postmodernism, rejecting a single narrative and incorporating history into what is contemporary. Postmodernism is concerned with social and cultural interpretations of a pluralistic nature. Robert Venturi, one of the founders of postmodern architecture and theory, made the case for the blending of styles of architecture. In his book, Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, Venturi speaks of paradoxical contrast and that through such duality comes unity. He contends that the result is added richness, complexity, and interest within a structure that is also highly relevant in post-preservation. The concept of facadism is relevant to this discussion, but is divergent from post-preservation in its lack of concern for maintaining an overall sense of historic integrity. Facadism is a practice that refers to saving the facade of a building and erecting a new building inside of the old structure, around it, or behind it. While it appears to appease both preservationists and developers, it often misses the mark through its lack of concern for authenticity and historic totality. The plurality associated with postmodernism is closely related to post-preservation and the creative, innovative rehabilitations that are allowing new generations to garner an appreciation for their city's historic architecture. New and old are coming together in bold and exciting ways that did not exist with early preservation efforts. Rehabilitation and contemporary additions are mechanisms of post-preservation, as outlined by characteristics 3 and 4 of my criteria. A successfully rehabilitated structure is one that sees a historic building transformed from an inefficient, outdated space into one where its historic character is met with modern convenience. Rehabilitation incorporates contemporary design elements into a historic structure, restoration of existing materials, improvement of layout, and an overhaul of infrastructure, all factors that contribute to meeting today's standards of living. According to architect and author Charles Blazes, quote, "Successful projects require not only a well-conceived new design, but a well-conceived old design," end quote. To properly rehabilitate requires that the distinctive features of the original building remain visible, contrasting with new design elements that anchor the building into the next era. The Ford Center in Minneapolis, a former Model T plant that was designed in 1912 by Frederick Keyes and Cyranous Colburn, is an example of adaptive reuse that embodies each of my characteristics of post-preservation. The Ford Center is a Chicago-style commercial building designed in the vein of architect Louis Sullivan. It is a symmetrical, utilitarian, classically restrained building of 10 stories, constructed of red brick and cream terracotta details. At the time of its rehabilitation, the Ford Center had fallen into derelict condition and was in need of investment. Mechanical, electrical, plumbing, communications, and fire safety systems all had to be replaced and updated, in addition to a variety of interior and exterior issues. The Ford Center is a contributing structure within the Minneapolis Warehouse Historic District. Therefore, it was afforded protection from demolition based on its historic status. United Properties purchased the building in 2007, a Polad company that also owns the Minnesota Twins, whose stadium is its neighbor just across 5th Street. The Ford Center, looming shabbily overhead, would have stood in stark contrast with the new baseball park, giving United Properties much incentive to invest in its overhaul. This is precisely the scenario that often contributes to post-preservation. Perhaps the developer does not actively seek out saving a historic building, but rather an opportunity arises that offers a multitude of benefits that would directly impact his interests. Marxism reminds us that in a free market capitalist economy, undertakings of this sort will only occur if it is financially viable. The Ford Center project received historic tax credits at both the state and federal levels. Therefore, character-defining features in the building had to be preserved, which included at least one of the historic elevator shafts where the vertical assembly line had operated, the historic stairwell, external doorways, steel windows, open floor plan, concrete columns, and the exterior facade. Hamill, Green, and Abramson were the architects, as well as the building's first tenant. They occupy floors 1 through 4 of the building, with Olson Advertising Agency and several smaller firms occupying the upper floors. Removing distracting secondary insertions is another important factor defined by the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. The Ford Center had an elevator addition made in the late 20th century, as well as a vestibule that functioned as the building's main entrance. These elements were considered intrusions and therefore removed. Federal standards require that new work be clearly differentiated from the original design. A new glass and steel entrance pavilion was added that is clearly distinguishable from the historic building. Part of differentiating new and old is to avoid a simulacrum, an inauthentic attempt to recreate historic elements of a building that are unsatisfactory in their imitation. The contemporary sleek design of the pavilion, compared to the warmth of the historic brick facade, creates a powerful juxtaposition and compounds the overall architectural interest of the building. The rehabilitation of the Ford Center goes beyond the traditional tenets of preservation with the characteristic duality of post-preservation at every turn. Sustainability, my fifth defining characteristic of post-preservation, is another important factor that distances my theory from the movement as founded. In architecture and in society in general, a tangible concern for sustainability has recently emerged, seen in the green movement through eco-friendly products, minimizing carbon footprints, and the recycling of waste. 40% of all natural materials extracted in the United States ends up in buildings or infrastructure. Thus, the reuse of existing buildings as an alternative to demolition and new construction can have a significant impact on the environment. The United States Green Building Council was established in 1993 and is best known for its LEED rating system. LEED classifies buildings into 4 categories, depending on their level of performance according to their set of defined metrics. While the USGBC and LEED are often at the forefront of discussion related to green building and design, issues of sustainability go beyond their bounds. Donovan Ripkema has concerns about the efficacy of the council and its LEED program, writing, quote, "If we listen to the USGBC, sustainable development is solar panels and waterless toilets. Environmentalists cheer when used tires are incorporated into asphalt shingles. But when we reuse a historic building, we're recycling the whole thing," end quote. Ripkema is accurately pointing out that the adaptive reuse of historic buildings is the ultimate recycling project. When a building is torn down, its solid waste disposal is not only expensive, it contributes to 1/3 of what is dumped in landfills, and its embodied energy is simultaneously thrown away. Further troubling is the waste of millions of dollars of infrastructure investment that was made by previous generations. While LEED cannot be the only measure of sustainability efforts, it does provide the framework to encourage green building practices. Combined with the preservation of extant structures whenever possible, communities are making great strides in sustainability. Such ecological concerns further separate post-preservation from the early movement as founded. Rehabilitations like the Ford Center are increasing in number, with variations of post-preservation having emerged years ago. The earliest example in the United States of a major adaptive reuse project is cited as Ghirardelli Square in San Francisco in 1964, which transformed the former chocolate factory compound into an integrated restaurant and retail center, saving the historic complex from being demolished and replaced with apartments. The concept of adaptive reuse is growing exponentially, particularly within the last 15 years. According to the statistical analysis prepared by the National Park Service, $4.47 billion has been invested in the rehabilitation of historic buildings in fiscal year 2015 alone. In Minneapolis, the first major example of adaptive reuse was the Butler Brothers building in 1972, which served as an impetus for further investment in the warehouse district. The cumulative result of these projects are thriving main streets and quaint neighborhood pockets, of which there are countless fine examples throughout the United States. Examples of post-preservation go beyond major utilitarian structures and large government commissions to include small commercial buildings and private residences, and can be found in towns large and small. More and more homeowners are engaging architects to transform and modernize historic properties, indicating a growing appreciation for heritage and sustainability in American culture. Historic properties offer character, originality, and fine craftsmanship that is often lacking in today's suburban sprawl. In conclusion, as we commemorate 50 years of the National Historic Preservation Act in 2016, it is clear that the preservation movement has evolved significantly since its inception, with changes being attributed to governmental policy, financial considerations, architectural innovations, and environmental concerns. Post-preservation is defined by its duality that incorporates new with old, resulting in community investment and renewal through the conservation of historic buildings. By examining a building like the Ford Center, it is clear that the old character remains, yet new life is breathed into it through contemporary design and technology, transforming the structure into an aesthetically appealing and optimally utilitarian space, ensuring its longevity for years to come. With post-preservation, the fervor to develop is balanced with a passion to preserve. Thank you. Questions? Yes. Yes. Well, the elevator, I'm going to go back to it here. So this is the elevator running alongside this upper portion of the north side of the building. That did not exist with the original design, so it was completely stripped down. They actually crushed up the brick, and that is the mulch that you see throughout the landscaping at the Ford Center, which is another sustainability measure that they incorporated. But the elevator is now just the modern elevator that they're using is within within the building. It's not seen from the outside. Yes. Thank you. You know, I definitely came across that in my research, and I talk about it a little bit in my paper, but the bottom line, I think, is that a non-gentrified area doesn't benefit anybody. And so, you know, whereas displacement of citizens can be argued, overall, with the generated tax revenue that it brings into a city of Minneapolis, it's ultimately more beneficial. And yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. You know, I think it hasn't been very well disseminated. I actually just stumbled across this a couple of weeks ago. So it's, educational initiatives, fora within the preservation field. They're doing seminars and things like that. I wish these were stamps. I think that would be a nice way. I know they do look like stamps. But it's primarily in Washington, D.C., so I haven't seen any major inclusions in Minnesota for the Preservation 50. Yes. Thank you. Absolutely. I mean, the United States is considered behind the times. They've been doing this in Europe for many, many decades because they already have had these historic structures that they're saving and incorporating. Some of the finest examples of this are found in Europe. I think I cite one of them just because I love the building so much. In Spain, but I was trying for this to keep it sort of American focused. But yeah, it's definitely something that's happening around the globe, and I think in Europe especially, they definitely care about ecological concerns and sustainability. Yeah, it's a beautiful building from the 18th century. Really neat project. It's a theater and community center. So, thank you so much.